Okay, so we know a little bit about what can and what does produce intergroup conflicts. And I've talked a little bit about how, in some ways, that's kind of inevitable from the way that we tie groups into our own self worth and self esteem. But groups can interact in a positive way, and we can improve intergroup relations in some pretty reliable ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those and how it's kind of hinted at from some of Sharif's work in bringing people together, basically. So a lot of times, if you think about how people can interact positively, happily before we turn to prejudice, the answer is yes, groups can interact positively, but how do they do it? Well, there's something about just contact and exposure that we've seen over the course of this semester that tends to improve our attitudes towards people. Propinquity, just seeing someone over and over again, gaining that familiarity from just exposure to them, increases liking. So does similarity, right? That if we see people as being close to, similar to ourselves, we're going to like them more. And if you can just get people to know each other and listen to each other and understand something about each other, there's something intuitively appealing about that idea that, well, if they just knew each other, things would be better. So this thinking stems from a very influential part of a book by our old pal Gordon Allport, who told us about attitudes and the definition of social psychology. He wrote a book called The Nature of Prejudice in 1954, and one of the chapters outlines what is now called the intergroup contact hypothesis or intergroup contact theory. So basically, Allport was saying something that we already knew from Sharif, that not every kind of contact is good. If you bring people together in competition, that's going to be bad. That's going to create more conflicts. But there are certain types of contact can be better. If it's just superficial and quick, that might just activate and reinforce stereotypes. Or if it's superficial in some way, then it's generally not going to be good. But there are certain types of contact that are going to help. And Allport's ideas about this have been really influential in figuring out how to improve relations between groups for coming up on 70 years now. So his four conditions for intergroup contact are that you have common goals, that there's cooperation, that there is equal status between the groups, and that there's some kind of support from authority. And this touches on a lot of things we've talked about over the course of the semester, right? So common goals, kind of like we saw in the Robbers Cave study, that the groups want to achieve something together. They both want the same thing, basically. There's mutual value. So maybe if there's a food shortage between two different groups, they could work together to gain that food. Or two marginalized groups might band together in order to increase their political impact or something like that. They need to have joint cooperation where they're not just both working toward a goal, they're working together toward a goal. They need each other in some way to achieve that goal. They need to work together because they would not be able to achieve it on their own. We've talked about status differences here a little bit too, and that frequently can be a driver of conflict. So equal status is very necessary. The reduction of hierarchies makes people seem more similar. If they're on equal footing, they seem less different. So having equal status is very important. And finally, having support from some sort of outside authority is very useful. This, is not always the clearest thing to manipulate. Like, how do you show an authority figure that matters to two different racial groups, like supports them working together, right? But if there can be some kind of support of this arrangement of equal status and cooperation from an authority group, or authority figure, then that can encourage this. So maybe the most famous example of this is something called the jigsaw classroom. This is something that one of your textbook authors, Elliot Aronson, came up with. And if you look on Canvas, in the kind of bonus content thing in this module is him, just a short 3-minute video talking about this intervention that he came up with some of his colleagues. So the superintendent in the Austin, Texas schools, I believe this was in the 80s, was a former student of Aronson's and knew some of the things that he knew about, intergroup contact and interventions. And he contacted Aronson and said, hey, we have a desegregated school in Austin that, there's busing here. There are Latino students and Black students and white students they're not getting along. And the white students are just doing better than the other students, even though, there's no reason to think they should be any different. And this conflict seems to be taking a toll on the students of color. So what can we do to improve the relations between people from these different groups in our school? So the intervention that Aronson came up with was put together basically to exemplify those 4 conditions that Allport had. So the way that they did it was, and if you haven't heard of the Jigsaw Classroom before, it is a teaching method invented here that puts students on equal footing working towards the same goal, right? The teacher is giving them an assignment and saying, hey, we need to learn about, whatever topic it happens to be. We're going to split up into these expert groups. And all these expert groups are going to learn something different. This group is going to learn about topic A, topic B, topic C, topic D, all these different groups. And then we're going to mix those groups up. So the expert groups will then go form other groups. And in a new group, you'll have somebody from expert group A, somebody from expert group B, and so on. And so they have each learned part of the lesson, and they're going to rely on each other to learn the rest of that lesson. And they need everyone's input. And you would have, mixed race groups or mixed whatever group is the point of contention in whatever setting you're in. So instead of seeing this really competitive environment for good grades and the teacher's attention and being able to ask a question, this really helped out, and it improved all sorts of things in this Austin, Texas school district. So how does this really fit through Allport's conditions? Well, they all have common goals. Everyone wants to succeed and learn and get a good grade on the exam. They all want to make the teacher happy. They are all learning different information. So they have to work together in order to achieve this goal. They need to hear from everyone in the group. Everyone needs to share. Everyone needs to listen. Equal status, there are no leaders in these groups. Every student in the second set of groups had an important piece of information. They all taught, they all learned, they all had the same sort of place in the hierarchy. In a sense, there was no hierarchy except for the teacher, which helps the equal status part. And then, of course, the teacher is emphasizing that this is a useful thing to do. They're spearheading the whole thing, so it has support from the teacher. So they did this for 8 weeks. They found there was greater respect among the groups for each other. The minority students had higher self-esteem. The absences of minority students, which was a big problem, that they just would not go to school because it was such a contentious environment, absences declined. And not just minority students, all students performed better. Even the students that were already doing well performed better. So this is, one of those points where you see interventions that are targeted to help a marginalized group almost never only help the marginalized group. They help everyone because it improves the overall environment. So 8 weeks, that's a pretty fast time to break down racial biases, right? To keep those from influencing your outcome. So it's very impressive that this works in the way that it did. So that's just one step in all of the contact research that has been going on in the last, at this point, I should probably change the slide to say 60 years, actually. There's been a lot of contact research. And 2 researchers, Tom Pettigrew and Linda Trop, did a meta-analysis that's been very influential about 15 years ago. Meta-analysis, if I haven't emphasized this enough, is where you have a big area of research where we've accumulated a lot of studies. You take all those studies that are published and you ask people for their unpublished data, because unpublished data is more likely to show no effects. So we want to have estimates of everything. You get all these data sets together and combine them basically to get an average sort of effect size. So they had 713 samples from 515 different articles and unpublished studies that had over 250,000 participants. So whatever we get from this is going to be a much more reliable estimate of how useful contact is than one study, right? So does contact improve these perceptions and relations over time? Almost every single study almost 19 out of 20 of them show that prejudice and stereotypes decreased or improved when there was contact. So there tend to be, standardized effect sizes in these meta-analyses. The relationship between contact and prejudice is not, the biggest in the world, but it's very consistent, small to medium sort of effect here, an R of negative 0.21. But this is all contact studies. If you only look at the studies that exemplified Allport's conditions, then that goes up quite a bit. If they meet all 4 conditions, then that effect size jumps up from 0.21 to 0.33. That's a pretty sizable jump, showing a lot of support for what Allport suggested, in the 50s. One kind of caveat element, there is an update of this meta-analysis that Pettigrew and Trop did that show these effects are still enduring, even with more research that we've seen over the last decade or so. But another recent look, they took Betsy Paluck, Donald Green, and another author who've done a lot of their own contact work. They're political scientists, actually, but they do a lot of field studies and contact work. They kind of narrowed the window of what Pettigrew and Trop looked at recently. And they looked at all these studies, but they only looked at the ones that had true randomized experimental designs and delayed outcomes. So you could do a contact study where you have people work together, and then right away you ask them, like, hey, how do you feel about them? Or do you want to work with them again? And those effects might be kind of temporary, right? So we'd want to know if they last. So Paluck and her co-authors just looked at the ones that had delayed outcomes and were randomized experiments. And the effects are still there. Their results are similar. But basically, it doesn't seem that this really works as well as we might like to think with racial or ethnic prejudice, especially for adults. It works better for children, presumably, before their attitudes about different groups are more crystallized. So there needs to be a lot more work about whether contact is really useful for racial and ethnic prejudice, particularly in adults. So that's still an area where we need to have more study. One other encouraging thing, though, is that real contact can be difficult. If 2 groups are in very contentious circumstances, bringing them together might be impractical or dangerous in some ways. So some researchers have thought, well, could we just have people imagine positive intergroup contact? And it does seem that just imagining it has positive effects. So Richard Crisp and Rhiannon Turner did a meta-analysis of all the imagined contact studies. And it does seem that just imagining having a positive sort of interaction with an intergroup, a member from an outgroup, improves implicit and explicit attitudes. And, prospective behaviors towards those people. So when contact might not be safe or possible, this is another way that we might use this sort of idea that coming together and thinking about how similar you are to other people and humanizing them can still have good effects, even if you can't actually carry out the interaction. So what's happening here? Why does contact work? There are more explanations here than we probably have time to go through. We'll kind of circle back to some in the prejudice unit. But here are some of them, that there is decategorization, that you're breaking down the boundaries between groups, mutual group distinctiveness, that you're reinforcing the good things about different groups, anxiety reduction, that, dealing with someone from a different group generally evokes anxiety from people, that they're being judged either for being stupid or racist are kind of the common things. And that makes people feel bad. You don't want to appear that way to someone. So that makes it difficult to have positive interactions when you're feeling bad from the start, basically. So intergroup friendships is another one, because, sharing self-disclosure of information with each other builds intimacy, and having friendships with someone from another group is a way to kind of generalize those feelings to other group members. One I just want to mention in a little more detail here is recategorization. Just to give you an example of one of these, is something called the common in-group identity model. So breaking down the boundaries of your group and recategorizing more groups into kind of a super group, basically. Recasting 2 groups as having a common in-group identity. So we've talked about how we really easily categorize people into us and them groups. Well, why don't we break down the boundaries between us and them and just think of us all as us, is as simple as this is. And they say basically, if you bring an in group and an out group together through contact, that's going to make them seem like one group. Think back to the Robbers Cave study that Sharif did. They had the Eagles and the Rattlers. They brought them together under those positive circumstances of contact, and they basically were inseparable after that. They recategorized themselves as one superordinate group, superordinate category that those boys all thought of as just us, not us and them. So, you have your group, you have another group, and they're kind of subsumed by this new overarching category. And this, happens in very common things that you see all the time in the world too. If you look at different movies, an outside threat can often recast two fighting groups as together. And you see this all the time. My very timely and not old at all example is Independence Day, where the whole world bands together as one force against the alien invasion. But there are tons of these different things where, there are groups at the beginning of a movie or book or show or whatever that are at odds, and there's some threat from the outside that brings them together. Watchmen being another example. It happens too with like sports and athletics. If, for example, you're a fan of a Big Ten team in the regular season, you probably are not big fans of another team there. They might be your rivals. You might have even hatred towards them. But in the postseason, when there are bowls or tournaments, like in college basketball or something, you often want to see people from your group do well, because you don't think about yourselves as necessarily just members of your group. You think about all of them as members of the conference that you all want to do well. So unfortunately, these, have a lot to do with introducing another third group to be a threat, basically. So you're kind of still using the ideas of conflict to reduce a particular conflict in a lot of ways. And you might kind of see this kind of stuff in more serious true to life types of things, like after an attack on a country, different groups inside of a country often like come together and recast themselves as more united than they perhaps were beforehand. But we're going to talk much more about these types of dynamics when we get to prejudice in our next unit. So I will leave it at that for now.